inhabitants in the Sundarbans in West Bengal is shrinking and shrinking fast. The island has shrunk by nearly 45% in the last 2 decades, inundating most of its low-lying areas. Families like Suttis who reside here are dreading the day when the entire island might just disappear. Sutti has already lost her house thrice in the past decade, and each time she moved inwards to build a new house, surging waters followed her.
पानी यहाँ पर जब आता है द्वीप खा जाता है, छोटा हो गया द्वीप और हम लोग का बहुत समस्या होता है और आदमी लोग का खाना नहीं होता है, जमीन चला जाता है नदी में, सब छोटा हो गया और आदमी बहुत चला।
People on the island create no carbon footprint. They have no electricity, no motor vehicles, and no electronic gadgets. Still, it's them who are paying the price of the reckless consumption of others.
जो हम लोग का इधर का जितना भी आदमी है 4800 आदमी यहाँ रहते हैं, उन लोग को पहुँचाना है। इसको जो एम्बांकमेंट का जो बाउंड्री है ना, उसको थोड़ा ऊंचा करना है और इधर का आदमी को दूसरा जगह में, अच्छा जगह में शिफ्ट करना है। उन लोग को बांटने के लिए कर्मसंस्थान भी मिलना चाहिए।
Climate experts have warned that if global average temperatures rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, it would lead to more suffering, especially among the world's poorest. As climate experts assemble in Poland, it's the voice of people in places such as Koramara Island that's fighting to be heard. Bureau Report.
আমাদের আত্মীয়স্বজন যারা আছে এখানে শুয়ে আছে, এসব জায়গায় আমার ভাই বিকারের বাড়ি ছিল, এসব বাড়িতে যদি নিয়ে গেছে, তখন এখানে মেলা ভাঙন ছিল, তার উপসর মেলা জায়গা ছিল।
1 দশক আগেও প্রায় 1000 খানেক পরিবারের বাসস্থান ছিল এই কালাবনে। এখন টিকে আছে রফিক গাজীর মতো হাতে গোনা কয়েকটি পরিবার।
আমার ঘর আগে ওইখানটা ছিল, ওই খানলোকার ওই যেখানে পানি চলে গেছিল, বাড়ির দাগে পড়েছিল।
চোখের সামনে তিলে তিলে নিঃশেষ হবে ছেলেবেলায় গরু চড়িয়ে ঘরে ফেরার 16 মিটার পথ, বাবার কাঁধে চড়ে প্রথম ডুবসাঁতারের স্বচ্ছ পুকুর। পৃথিবীর মানচিত্র থেকে একে একে মুছে যাবে প্রিয় মাতৃভূমির সমস্ত স্মৃতি। স্যাটেলাইট থেকে পাওয়া মানচিত্রের পুরনো ছবি বিশ্লেষণ করলে দেখা যায় মাত্র কয়েক বছরের ব্যবধানে কালাবকে পরিণত হয়েছে একটি বিচ্ছিন্ন দ্বীপে। একইভাবে জলবায়ু পরিবর্তনের প্রভাবে ক্ষতির মুখে বাংলাদেশ উপকূলের প্রায় সকল জনপদ। প্রতিনিয়ত ঘরহারা হচ্ছেন সাধারণ মানুষ।
দাদা, এটা আপনার বাড়ি? এটা আপনি এখানে কতদিন আছেন? এখান থেকে আমার জন্ম এখানে। হ্যাঁ, বহুদিন ধরে যখন এই দেখতে দেখতে বাড়িতে বাঁধতে এই করতে এই রাস্তা করে এইটুকুই, মানে এতটুকু জায়গার মধ্যে এটা তো যে কোনো সময় চলে যেতে মনে হচ্ছে।
যে নদীমাতার আশ্রয়ে একসময় গড়ে উঠেছিল সমৃদ্ধ লোকালয়, তার আগ্রাসনেই মানুষ আজ অসহায়।
I'm standing in the middle of Poshu River in Bagirhat in Bangladesh. During dry season, there's not enough water from upstream, so causing the extra sediments to raise the riverbed. But during monsoon, the extra rainfall and extra sediment causes river erosion, rendering hundreds of people homeless. This is not a climate crisis anymore. This is a climate emergency for people living in the coastal areas of Bangladesh.
অন্যদিকে ঋতু পরিবর্তনের প্রচলিত হিসাব নিকেশ পাল্টে যাওয়ায় হুমকির মুখে সাধারণের জীবন জীবিকা।
কালকে যদি ধর কালকে যদি কিছু হয় তা না, হয়তো জ্যৈষ্ঠ বসে মজা হচ্ছে এরকম ধরনের হঠাৎ হয়তো উঠলো কিনারে আসতে আসতে লোকেরা উঠতে
গরমটা কি বেশি বাড়ছে, আবার যখন বর্ষা হবে তখন কিন্তু বর্ষা হচ্ছে না, বর্ষা কম, বর্ষা খুব কম। এই বর্ষা ধান পাতায় ধরে জল দেবে আষাঢ় শ্রাবণ মাসে, তারা কিন্তু এখন পুকুরে অনেকক্ষণ দিয়ে পাতায় জল দিচ্ছে ধান পাতা রোদ। এখন সেই বর্ষায় হাত
আপনি যখন ছোট ছিলেন তখন কিরকম দেখছেন এখানে তখন কি কি হইতো এবং এখন কি পরিবর্তন?
ধান পাটি খায় ছিল, ধান ছিল
এখানে ধান ছিল
বাসা মাঠে উঠতে খাওয়া দাওয়া খুব ভালো ছিল।
এখানেই শেষ নয়, ঘর ও জীবিকা হারানোর পাশাপাশি দিন দিন এখানে তীব্র হচ্ছে খাবার পানির সংকট।
হ্যাঁ আমাদের আছে।
আপনার সমস্যা পানি টানি ব্যবহার করেন?
না এখানে আমাদের পুকুরের পানি নোনা, এখান থেকে আমরা পানি ব্যবহার করতে পারি না। আমি
কত 6 ঘন্টা?
1 ঘন্টা লাগে।
1 ঘন্টা লাগে। তো আপনার যত সমস্যা এরকম আপনার 1 নম্বর সমস্যা কোনটা? তাহলে আপনার পানি বেশি খান সবাই চিকিৎসা করে ফেলে পানি
আরো 1 মাস পরে আরো বেশি করতে আরো রান্না করতে আরো 1 মাস পরে আমরা রোদ্রে পানি খাই সব ছটফট করি।
সালের অক্টোবর মাসের শেষ সপ্তাহের এই উপকূল যাত্রা আমাকে চোখে আঙুল দিয়ে দেখিয়ে দিল মানুষের জীবনমান উন্নয়নের যে সংগ্রাম আমরা দীর্ঘদিন ধরে চালিয়ে আসছি, প্রকৃতির সাথে সন্ধি ছাড়া তাদের সফলতা কখনোই সম্ভব নয়। উন্নত জীবনযাপন নিশ্চিত করতে গিয়ে দিনের পর দিন পরিবেশের যে ক্ষতি আমরা করে গেছি, করে যাচ্ছি, সেই প্রতিশোধই প্রকৃতি নিচ্ছে আমাদের উপর। কিন্তু প্রায়শ্চিত্তের শুরুটা হয়েছে সবচেয়ে নিষ্পাপ থেকে।
The year was 1938. A British engineer's holiday was about to change the world. His name was Guy Callender. That year, he decided to take a break. But instead of relaxing, Callender had other ideas. He pursued his two great loves, bikes and meteorology. Callender started collecting records from various weather stations, around 147 in total. And remember, this was before the computer, so all the calculations were done by hand. And what did he find? That global temperatures had been rising by around 0.3 degrees Celsius in 50 years. It was a landmark discovery. The only question left was why. Callender blamed it on carbon dioxide. He said emissions from the industry were responsible. In hindsight, even emissions from his own beloved bikes. None of it mattered though, because in 1938 no one took him seriously. For starters, he was an engineer, not a scientist. So people said it's not his field of expertise. Also, the idea itself was too big to accept that human beings could alter the temperature of something so big, our planet. So Callender's work was dismissed. Interestingly, he did not think that global warming was bad. He thought it was good. So how did we go from denying global warming to accepting it? How did we link it to greenhouse gases? Also, how did the whole greenhouse analogy came about? Time for a flashback. Where do you think the climate change timeline begins? The 19th century? Maybe the 20th century? Well, both answers are wrong. Even the ancient Greeks had an inkling about it. Like this man, Theophrastus. He was a disciple of Aristotle. Now, he did not have computers or fancy machines, so he simply observed. And what did he see? In the Thessaly region,
temperatures cooled when the marshes were drained. In Philippi, when the forests were cut, it became warm. So Theophrastus joined the dots. Human actions led to climate change. He couldn't quantify or prove it, but he knew what was happening. Such localized climate change theories have been around for a long, long time. Some of them turned out to be fake. Like rain follows the plow. It was all the rage in the 19th century. People thought human settlement would lead to more rainfall. For example, assume there's a piece of arid land. It's all dry with no rain. Suddenly people decide to settle there. They begin plowing the land to cultivate crops. In the 19th century, people thought this would lead to rainfall. Just stay in some place, plow the land, grow some crops, and rain will follow. Of course, it doesn't work like that. Such ideas were limited to certain regions. It was all localized. None of them thought global climate change was possible. That too by human action. But without knowing that, we were setting the stage for it. I'm talking about the industrial age. We built the steam engine. We built dozens of factories. All of it was done by burning coal. This became ground zero for climate change, for global warming. And when did we realize this? Well, it took a lot of time. In the 1820s, we took one major step forward. We understood the greenhouse effect. And it was proposed by this man, Joseph Fourier, a French physicist. And his logic was quite simple. Sunlight brings heat to the earth. If the earth reflected all of it back, it would be a cold wasteland. But the earth is not a cold wasteland, meaning some of the heat is stored within. It is trapped. Now Fourier said, the atmosphere is doing all of this. It is trapping some of the heat from the sun, which is exactly what a greenhouse does. Other scientists built on this theory. One of them was Eunice Newton Foote. She was an amateur scientist in the United States. In the 1850s, she conducted crucial experiments. Again, the concept was simple. She put mercury thermometers inside different glass cylinders. And what did she observe? The cylinders with carbon dioxide were hotter. So Foote joined the dots. There was something about this gas, this carbon dioxide. It had the ability to make the air hotter. In 1856, her work was presented at the AAAS, the American Association for Advancement of Science, but guess who presented it? Not Foote, but her male colleague. Welcome to the 19th century. Foote's work was largely ignored during her lifetime. It was only recently that she has been acknowledged. 3 years after Foote's paper, another one was published, this time by John Tyndall, an Irish physicist. Now, if you're in school right now, you may recognize this name, John Tyndall, especially from the Tyndall effect. But don't worry, we will not go into that. We are focusing on his climate change experiments. Tyndall refined what Eunice Foote found. He proved the greenhouse effect, that gases like carbon dioxide could absorb heat. That's what he proved. His paper credits another scientist named Matthias Pouillet, but it doesn't mention Foote. Maybe he did not know about her work, or maybe he thought it was not relevant. Either way, by the late 1800s, scientists knew a couple of things. The greenhouse effect was real, and gases like carbon dioxide could trap more heat. Just one problem though. No one looked at the larger picture. No one applied these findings to our planet's temperature. It finally happened in the year 1895, thanks to a Swedish chemist, Svante Arrhenius. He wasn't actually studying global warming, he was studying the opposite. He was looking at global cooling. Arrhenius was trying to explain the ice ages. What would have caused it? He zeroed it on carbon dioxide. First he gathered data on global temperatures, then he began calculations, and guess how many? Between 10,000 and 100,000. That's how many calculations it took Arrhenius. 1 year later, in 1896, he published his paper. And the takeaway was simple. If CO2 levels were halved, temperatures would fall by 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. So lesser the CO2, lesser the temperature. It was job done for Arrhenius, but soon he started wondering, what if the opposite happened? What if CO2 levels doubled instead of halving? Then temperatures would rise by 5 to 6 degrees. Not many people bought it, especially after hearing his next claim. Arrhenius linked CO2 levels to the burning of coal. He said CO2 levels would increase by 50% in 3,000 years. I guess he was wrong. Not about coal, but about the speed. Because in the 20th century alone, CO2 levels increased by 30%. Anyway, Arrhenius went on to win the Nobel Prize, not for climate change though. That part of his work was always polarizing. His theory was finally proven in 1938. It was too late by then. Arrhenius died 9 years before Guy Calendar's experiment. So let's recap again. By the 1940s, scientists knew three things. Greenhouse effect was real, carbon dioxide was among the main culprits, and coal burning would lead to global warming. Again, just one problem. No one thought it was an issue. Not Guy Callendar, not Svante Arrhenius, and not John Tyndall. They all thought it was great for the world. The cold, uninhabitable places would get warm. No fears of another ice age. Also, more agriculture in higher latitudes. What's not to like? It would take decades to change that attitude. In fact, forget global warming. In the 1970s, some scientists were worried about global cooling. In 1974, the Time magazine carried this article, "Another Ice Age?" It was mostly because of aerosol pollutants. These could block and reflect the sunlight, and after World War II, these pollutants were everywhere. So global temperatures did fall from 1940 to 1970, but this was temporary. By the late 1970s, the cooling stopped. The Earth was now on a highway to warming. And when did we realize that this was a bad thing? Many scientists point to the year 1988. That summer was the hottest on record. We had wildfires, droughts, and all kinds of climate events. So politicians took notice. The same year, a NASA scientist gave an alarming warning. His name was James Hansen. He said he was 99% sure that global warming was upon us. That's when things went into overdrive. In 1989, the IPCC was formed, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Its job was to study the evidence, to see how bad things were. And by now, computers were more common, so temperature calculations were easier. Scientists predicted multiple climate disasters, like droughts, wildfires, and powerful hurricanes. They also began talking about sea levels. As polar ice melts, more water would be added to the sea. More water equals rising sea levels. Studies claimed the seas could rise by up to 98 centimeters by the year 2100. It was a proper SOS. Governments realized they had to act. Like nuclear weapons and global peace, climate change became an international issue. So in 1995, the first COP was held, the Conference of Parties, the annual climate summit. 2 years later came the Kyoto Protocol. It was the first global agreement to cut emissions. 41 countries signed the Kyoto Protocol. The target was to cut emissions below the 1990 level. A second agreement was signed in 2015, the Paris Climate Deal. This time, 197 countries signed on. They agreed to voluntarily cut emissions, but unfortunately, both deals have proved inadequate. Today, climate change is a proven science. But tell that to our politicians. Many of them still ignore it, some of them downright deny it. But you see, climate change denial is not like saying that the earth is flat or that the moon landing did not happen. It's not just another conspiracy theory, it's an existential threat to humans. The ancient Greeks had inklings about it. 19th century scientists made assumptions about it. And 20th century experts proved it. The question is, can 21st century politicians do their part?
We're in a climate change world. The science will always continue to evolve, but we know enough now to act, and we are acting.
We have to see this as an opportunity to learn from the mistakes that we have made.
The way we've been doing things in the past is just no longer going to be possible in the future.
The Earth's climate is changing. We're confronted with a change in our environment which is unprecedented in human history. Due to the emission of greenhouse gases that trap heat in the atmosphere, we are experiencing the warming of land, air, and oceans. The effects of this are numerous. There's an increase in the risk of more extreme and intense weather events, such as tropical storms, droughts, and flooding. Consequences include a rise in sea level, reduced food production, a reduction in plant and animal life, and harm to ocean ecosystems.
The two main pillars of the Global Climate Change Convention are adaptation and mitigation, and it is the responsibility of this generation, all of us who are alive right now, to mitigate enough. That means to bring greenhouse gas emissions down enough to allow that adaptation, in particular in the most vulnerable communities, is actually possible and effective. Adaptation is the invitation that we're being given to change behaviors and consumption and production patterns that we've had for 100 and 150 years that are simply no longer sustainable.
Adaptation measures are effective and actually do increase resilience.
We need to reform our model of development. We need a model of development that encompasses respect for human rights, good governance, respect for the right of community, respect for indigenous people's rights. We cannot be hopeless. We may need help, but we're not helpless. And I think in our context where adaptation is really important.
Adaptation also requires financial resources. Vulnerable developing countries need financial support to make the necessary investments. Resources for adaptation also include the collaborative efforts of many different people. Strategies to build disaster and climate resilience should engage all sectors of society and government and require the input of all people involved.
Sharing lessons, identifying best practices is essential for adaptation. Building a long-term vision based on that knowledge that we gain is essential. At the core, or one of the actions that is already underway, is what we call national adaptation plans, which are already being implemented in many countries.
Adaptation helps our societies and nature cope with climate change. There are many ways to do it, and communities need to decide what works best for them. There are many examples. Here are just three.
For many communities, they've been dealing with climate for generations. I give the example of communities who live on small islands and traditionally have been dealing with the risk of flooding, where, for example, their small island shrinks in half because the river rises and erodes the outside of the island. They build their houses on the top of that island, and when it floods for about 7 months of the year, that island turns literally into a small mound of land. Climate change is going to affect the frequency and severity of that flooding they've been experiencing for generations. There's a reason why those communities are living on these islands that turn into these small mounds. It's because they're living in poverty, it's because of their marginalization, it's because of a variety of issues that are related to basic development. And so as the international community works with those communities, with the governments, to help secure better livelihoods, they need to make sure that what they're doing on adaptation to climate change is integrally related to what they're doing on development. Adaptation and development really do go hand in hand.
Jalankulo Sea is an urban neighborhood in Maputo, Mozambique. More than 150,000 people live here. However, there is only one drainage ditch. When torrential rain caused by the changing climate became frequent, the neighborhood became prone to flooding. Worse still, people had thrown waste into the drains, and the flooding spread the waste around the neighborhood. This led to malaria and other illnesses, particularly among children. Establishing awareness and communication channels among the local citizens and between the municipality and the relevant institutions was very important. Public-private partnerships empowered the people living in Maputo to design and implement activities to adapt to climate change. The local people proposed a construction project to clean the ditch, allowing it to drain properly and to manage local waste. In the Netherlands, 60% of the country is vulnerable to flooding, which means that there is a need to plan for the future. There they've developed the Delta program. Its aim is to protect the country against high water levels and to ensure an adequate fresh water supply. It looks 100 years ahead and also includes measures to deal with more immediate problems.
Climate change, for example, is affecting the frequency of floods. So communities that used to experience a 1 in 100-year flood may now be experiencing a 1 in 25-year flood. What does that mean for infrastructure? We're spending a lot of money on building roads and bridges. And if we don't take that change in the frequency of flooding into account, we may build a road or a bridge in an area that is really at risk of flooding in a way that it wasn't before. Why not take that new information into account, move where you build that road so it's on safer ground? That investment today will actually save us money in the future. There are studies that have been done that show that $1 in preparedness, $1 in forethought will actually save $4 to $7 in response. And what we as the international community need to do is start thinking about spending that money today in order to save that money in the future.
People living in the Bangladesh Delta are extremely vulnerable to problems caused by erosion, soil salinity, frequent floods and cyclones. The population here is dependent mostly on rice cultivation for their food. In a nationwide project, the women of the community started developing practical solutions to adapt. They raised dikes for ponds to preserve fresh water all year round. They stopped saltwater intrusion into canals. And they built a bunker for their own safety during cyclones. Thus they have come up with their own solutions to ensure their own survival and security of food and water supply. Using their own initiative, the women have created resilience for themselves and their community. The effects of adaptation can be immediate. However, people in vulnerable areas need help to access resources, including financing and knowledge. People can develop creative ideas and innovative solutions. They can build partnerships with local administration bodies and organizations. Building climate resilience and the capacity to adapt provides more than just climate-related benefits. Its influence has beneficial effects for individuals, families, communities, countries, and society as a whole.
If we don't adapt, we threaten to roll back decades of progress in reducing poverty and improving economic growth. It really does compromise the stability and security of communities and countries. So we have an opportunity to act now and to make investments in adaptation that will have an impact in terms of the future.
We also have to see this as an opportunity to transform society, an opportunity to learn from the mistakes that we have made and be able to build better so that we can have a future for us and for future generations that is safer, that has the same opportunities, and that is better for all.
Very often I get asked, well, and what if we don't do that? What's the plan? What are we going to do if we're not able to address climate change? And the simple answer to that is we don't have plan B because we don't have planet B. We have one planet. And so plan A is we are going to address climate change. That doesn't mean that it's easy, because if it were easy, we would have done it. But none of us can hide behind the responsibility and the commitment that we